yesterday to kind of go over this PowerPoint and nail it down. And so let me just tell you what the outline of the presentation is going to be. First, and I'm going to quickly go through this, which is just to give you a summary of 30 years of sport media scholarship, just to kind of set the tone for what we're talking about here. And then I will turn it over to Nicole, who will introduce to you the whole issue of the espnW brand. She will talk mostly, I might chime in a little bit about our attendance. We both went to the espnW retreat at Torrey Pines in September. And then we want to end with some issues around what we think are facts versus fiction about what's sort of out there in the blogosphere and in mainstream media about what espnW is all about. Hey, how are you? Okay, again, I want to quickly go through this because I think most people know. For 30 years now, sports sociologists have developed, I think, a pretty sophisticated body of knowledge in which we found two major findings, and there are people in this room who have contributed over the years to that body of knowledge. And those two major findings are that female athletes are significantly underrepresented when it comes to the amount of media coverage they receive, even though they represent, on average nationwide, 40% of all participants. So for example, 40% of all scholarship athletes at Division I schools are female. They still only get, in the best of times, 6 to 8% of all sport media coverage. And the second major finding is that when they are emphasized or portrayed, that their femininity and their sexuality is consistently emphasized over their athletic competence. And sports scholars like myself and others have made the point that the result of this sort of systematic portrayal is that female athletes remain second-class citizens. They are not taken seriously, they are marginalized, they are trivialized, and are not given the respect, the dignity, and certainly the resources that a number of people think that they are due. So let me just quickly give you some examples of what we mean. Here are some exemplars of what you'll find out there with respect to media images. Again, this notion of sexualizing female athletes off the court, out of uniform, and in highly sexualized poses. This is Jenny Thompson in Sports Illustrated, one of the most celebrated U.S. Olympic swimmers. You're going to have to tell me her name. She's a snowboarder.
Gretchen Bleiler.
Also an Olympic gold medalist. Serena Williams. And I put this up there because this will become important when we talk about a lot of people's concerns about what is espnW going to be all about. Is it going to be sort of another rendition of Sports Illustrated for Women, which was a big failure, meaning it didn't generate a lot of interest and a lot of subscriptions, and those of us who critiqued it and criticized it said, well, why would you have expected anything else? You're going to come out once a month, and you're going to emphasize stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with women's sports or women's competence, like you did with Sports Illustrated for Women. Now, those images then are in sharp contrast to seeing female athletes as highly competent. This is the same woman, Gretchen Bleiler, in action, and that gives you, I would argue, a very different feeling about women's sports. Okay? And then that's another way to think about Serena Williams. All right, so in any event, the point is, this is the career that I have built for myself in part in terms of having a reputation around doing sport media scholarship along with being the director of the Tucker Center. So over a year ago, I was contacted by a woman named Ann Hoffer, who is part of the espnW team. She has actually a local connection here at the University of Minnesota. Her uncle is Bill Donahue, who is in the Office of General Counsel, and I've known Bill for many years. He has been an early and often supporter of me and the Tucker Center. So I got a call from Ann saying, hey, I just talked to my Uncle Bill, and he said, he knows what I'm doing with espnW, and he said, you really need to talk with Mary Jo Kane. So she came over, told me about espnW. Would I be interested in being on the advisory board? And I said, well, it would depend on what capacity you would want me to play. And, I have been a critic from the outside looking in, and that is, I'm happy to offer my advice, but I'm also not going to soft pedal my advice and my critique. So she suggested, and I agreed to have a follow-up conversation with the woman who's really sort of the brains and the quarterback behind espnW, and that's a woman named Laura Gentili, whom you'll hear a little bit more about from Nicole. So I talked with Laura. I was very impressed with her and her vision, and I agreed to be on the advisory board and thus agreed to participate in the retreat. So I'm going to now turn it over to Nicole to talk about espnW in general and the retreat more particularly. And it was at the reason we're talking about the retreat is that it was at the retreat in September that espnW did a whole national media launch of the espnW brand. And it got a tremendous amount of national media, some good and frankly some not so good.
And we've been getting a lot of questions about what is espnW. And if you go and Google it, you'll be really hard pressed to find much information about it. So part of this session was to let kind of our inside scholarly circle know what's going on, but also to kind of parlay some rumors that are going on about ESPN. So the mission, and this is directly from some of the brand launch materials that we have received about ESPN by being part of the retreat, is that the ESPN mission is to serve, inform, and inspire the female athlete and fan. That is their mission. And they're building their product along that line. I'm just going to close that door a second. Now the target audience for ESPN are female sport fans. Sports-minded women that are 18 plus. They want to capitalize on the large numbers of girls and women that have been participating in sports post-Title IX and capture them as consumers of the ESPN brand. Through their research that they have done leading up to this brand launch, they found that a lot of female sport fans feel that there's nothing in the sport media sphere that speaks to them. They feel alienated. And so they want to create a space in which is welcoming to fans of sport, female fans of sport, both of men's sport and women's sport. And I want to read you a quote by Laura Gentili. She says that women see us as an admirable brand, being ESPN. Women see us as an admirable brand that has authority, but they see us as their father's brand or husband's brand or boyfriend's brand, and they recognize it as not theirs. So they want to create a space where female fans feel, hi Doug, you get to sit in the front. And oftentimes these female sport fans feel they have to prove that they're a fan. As a man, I think you're oftentimes assumed to be a sport fan, but if you're a female sport fan, the women in their research group said, well, we have to prove that we're fans over and over again. And I think by conversations that we've had with espnW, that there's really a critical distinction here. Their target audience is female sport fans, not fans of women's sport. And that's a really important concept. Not fans of women's sport. Female sport fans of men's and women's sports. And I don't think their target audience are what I would call brand champions. Females that already love ESPN, that are high sport consumers and regularly visit and watch ESPN products. That is not their target audience. We know that women are sport fans, and the research out there in terms of the percentages of women that attend different professional sport leagues is fairly telling. That there are significant numbers of women that attend professional sports, but again, they often feel that these leagues and teams do not specifically speak to them. They don't feel engaged, and I think even more so, I think we have less effectively engaged the fans of women's sport. Nobody's really, I think, effectively captured that audience. So our experiences then at the retreat, when Dr. Kane and I went out to Torrey Pines in San Diego, which could be characterized as a resort of the rich and famous. Categories probably neither Mary Jo and I fall into, but there we were.
Speak for yourself.
Oh. I knew I was waiting for it. But that ESPN saw a gap in the market, and I think over the course of the last 2 years, Laura Gentile has put together a really great team. And I think of our experience at the retreat was, we're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. I mean, as academics, when we go to conferences, we're not used to kind of the way that corporate America and a big corporation like ESPN does events. It was first class, it was glitz and glam and swag abound, and it was really quite entertaining to be a part of that. But the point here of telling you that is, if the way that they did the retreat is any indication of the seriousness by which they will create espnW, we have a really good chance of success. This was a first-class event. They're very serious about this, and it makes those of us who are advocates and supporters of women's sport excited. So I tell you about the retreat in that way. We've been talking a lot about Laura Gentile. Here's a picture of her so you can do the face name recognition. She's the current VP. She's the brains behind the entity here. And as Mary Jo said, we've both had numerous conversations with her leading up to the retreat. Another thing about espnW is that in their materials they claim that it's by women for women. And here's the team that Laura has put together. There are 2 team members missing, 2 men that are not pictured here. I think this was from the Women's Sport Foundation Gala that was last week. But there are a number of women on her team that are dedicated to launching and promoting this brand.
Is there a little more diversity in the rest of the team? Or?
That is the team.
Okay.
From what I understand, that's the team and 2 men who are not pictured. And that wasn't intentional on their part. Also at the retreat, there were quite a few advocates and movers and shakers and notable personalities in women's sport, including a lot of professional female athletes. And you can see Julie Foudy here sitting with Billie Jean King. They were having a conversation about the trajectory of women's sport over time. And they're up on the stage that ESPN had put together. So there were a lot of female athletes there, a lot of movers and shakers, as I said. And there were also a lot of ESPN personalities. So we're just going to do a little game here. On your piece of paper, how many of these women can you name? Out of 5. And no cheating. So just you, write it down. Oh, there's 6. I'm sorry, 6. Well, if you can name 5, that's good. So see if you can get 5 out of 6, at least. All right, who thinks they have all 6 and wants to take a crack at it? No? Interesting. All right, I was wondering if anybody would know all 6. So here we go. Who's this?
Kara Lawson.
Kara Lawson does women's basketball.
Tennessee.
She played at Tennessee.
Carolyn
Peck, who does women's basketball, was also a coach at Purdue, won the national championship. Doris Burke. Doris Burke, not Debbie Antonelli, no. She also is another one, but she was not there. Sage Steele, Hannah Storm, and Michelle Beadle. So there, if you learn nothing else today, now you can name your ESPN sport personalities. Now, in addition to the athletes and movers and shakers and sport personalities, they invited a few academics to tag along to the event, including Dr. Kane and I. And Dr. Kane was invited, along with multiple events and conversations that were happening at the retreat. There was a series of breakout sessions and panels of which Dr. Kane was a part of about female sport fans. So I'm going to turn it back over to her, and she will talk about some of her comments that she made on that panel.
I was asked by Laura Gentile to talk about the whole issue of female sport fans, and I said before I was going in that I hadn't done really, frankly, much research on this, that my research was on, obviously, media representations of female athletes, but that I would see what I could find out there, both in terms of the research literature, primarily in sport management literature, and some other stuff that I could find in the marketing. I'm looking at you and in your people's literature. So in any event, so here were some of the major points that I made in my panel presentation. I found many, many parallels between females as athletes and females as fans, meaning the feeling that female fans, when you look at sport and marketing research and sport consumption research, it's almost entirely about men, very little about women, and certainly seeing women as serious sports fans, where the assumption is if you're a female and you're a sports fan, by definition you're interested in women's sports, which of course is not true, as the data show from what Dr. Lavoie presented earlier. So that was the first argument that I made, that female athletes, or females as fans, like females as athletes, frankly, they simply don't get any respect. They are not seen as central to the sporting enterprise by marketers and promoters of sports. The next point that I made was that I felt that there were these oft-repeated gender comparisons that I heard constantly anyway. And I heard a lot at the retreat, again, well-meaning, but this constant, well, what are we going to do about women's sports when we talk about women's sports? Because, you know, if you compare the attendance records of the WNBA to the NBA, and, you know, and the sky's falling, and oh my God, and I made the point that those oft-repeated gender comparisons simply miss the point, and I think mislead the critique and the analysis, and lead to false conclusions. And the point that I was trying to make is that when you compare, say, the WNBA to the NBA, and then you go, oh my God, there's no way that the WNBA will ever succeed, and thus not an interest in women's sports and an interest in women as fans, I tried to make the point that that's like comparing not just apples to oranges, but apples to orange groves. It's like comparing a startup technology company to Microsoft, and 10 years in saying, oh my God, why aren't they beating Microsoft? Because when you look at the historical relationship between sport and gender, and how the entire structure and tradition of the United States is to make sports synonymous with males, and to stigmatize males that are not interested in sports, and to do the opposite until very recently with women, that there's not only an infrastructure and a cultural support network for women, but for women of my generation and before who took sports seriously, we were the ones who were stigmatized. So therefore to say, well, how come women's sports aren't equal to men? Big surprise. So it's a false comparison, which leads to false conclusions. And the other point that I tried to make is that, as with any group that has had a monopoly on power in an institution as powerful as sport, it wasn't like, and I'm not picking on men, but the point is, as with race, or age, or money, or tenured faculty versus non-tenured faculty, the group in power doesn't just say, oh my gosh, you're right. I'm so sorry we didn't give you 50% of the pie. Come on in, espnW. That I felt that to not look at the power structure in ESPN, which is very male-dominated, and to think that they would simply just say, oh, no problem, here, let us give you as much of the pie as you want, was naive at best. So that they need to factor into the equation the issue of male resistance. What I hadn't factored into the equation, which Dr. Lavoie will talk about, is the resistance of women, fans, who care deeply about men's sports and how they are interpreting what they think espnW is all about. Okay, so, and then my other concern was that if we don't take these things into account, that I thought, like going back to Sports Illustrated for Women, or Women's Sport and Fitness magazine, we were going to be witnessing deja vu all over again. And what do I mean by that? That my fear was that espnW was going to end up being Shape magazine with some box scores. And then we would have an unmet hypothesis which said there is no interest in women's sports, or there is no interest in women as fans because women aren't that interested. And my argument is, if it's going to be Shape magazine with box scores, you're never going to know that because you've never tested that. because you're not going after an audience of deeply committed and interested sports fans and deeply committed and interested athletes engaged in women's sports. So my concern was that if espnW's content was going to be on sort of lifestyles with some box scores versus sports, we were in for big trouble. And I want to say, to be very fair to espnW, that is not something that I got ever from Laura Gentili or her team. I think a lot of it has to do with just being immersed in this world of doing research on women in sports and seeing women as fans and as athletes totally marginalized. So I think, frankly, I went in with a little bit of a bias, and so I do want to be fair to espnW. And then again, my point is that the punchline, if it's going to be Shape Magazine, is that the response will be, see, we told you there's no audience for women's sports, we told you women aren't interested as fans, they don't need espnW, and that was my very big concern. Then I think the other thing that happened that was unfortunate during this time period is that as there was this major media launch, Laura Gentili was the day of the retreat, I think it was the day of the retreat that it opened. Laura Gentili was quoted in USA Today talking about the retreat, and here was her now infamous quote. Meaning the retreat and espnW is where we talk about women finding self-esteem in sports and about getting a pedicure. And this erupted apparently on the blogosphere, which Dr. LeWoy will tell you about in a minute, but I can tell you that when I got back from the retreat, I was contacted by a number of media outlets and did do an interview with the New York Times. And one of the things that the New York Times reporter pressed me about, in terms of what I thought the new espnW was going to be all about, kept bringing up Laura Gentili's quote and said, do you think that that's what espnW is going to be all about? And if it is, do you think it will succeed? And I tried to be very fair to Laura and say, having been misquoted a lot in the press, well, I think that what Laura was talking about was the retreat itself at Torrey Pines, which was, as talk about, you know, a world that we're not that familiar with, like having limousines pick you up at the airport, having spas, et cetera, that was all part of the retreat if you wanted to participate at that level. So when that quote came out in USA Today, I think in many ways it kind of unfortunately kind of blew up, and it certainly apparently blew up in the blogosphere, and so I will now turn that part over to Dr. LeWoy.
Okay. And I think the reason why this blew up in the blogosphere was really because, as I said in the beginning, espnW wasn't doing a lot to be proactively communicating with the people that wanted to know about this. And so in that vacuum of knowledge and the fact that it doesn't really exist yet, people were speculating and making assumptions and criticizing it, much like I think Dr. Kane and I went in kind of with a critical eye because of our background in knowing the sport media literature and women's sport. And I want to share with you some of the backlash in the blogosphere, because I got a lot of, Mary Jo gets calls from the New York Times, I get emails from other colleagues who write sports blogs, and they were saying, what is going on at the espnW? And there was I got a lot of questions about what is going on from sports bloggers. And from reading lots of blogs, I want to kind of give you a summary of some of the critique that was going on that was really not very different from our critique. One is that many felt that espnW would be a girlier or a feminized version of ESPN, and in order to attract female sport fans, this needed to happen, and that was just really, it was insulting. It didn't recognize the fact that many females are already sport fans, and they don't need to wear pink hats and have bedazzled t-shirts in order to be attracted to ESPN. So that was one critique. The other one is that by the creation of espnW, it gives ESPN the excuse to relegate women's sport, you know, to the hinterlands, so to speak. That you could say, well, we're doing something, but it's not going to be on par with the real ESPN, which is ESPN, period. There's no M on the end, right? So, And one of the bloggers said, this is just indication that we're heading down the track to have ESPN 8 the Ocho. And that might have been fair, and we'll get to why that's not exactly accurate when we get to the fact versus fiction. The other one, some people felt that, again, it would segregate, it wouldn't be equal, it would be separated and ghettoized form of ESPN, so it wouldn't be separate but equal, it would just be separate and marginalized. And the last one, and maybe this was my favorite critique, because I thought it was quite clever, is that this blogger just really didn't like it, it's ESPNL for lame. And I want to read you a quote by a blogger from the Cross Conference Collector. It's two female fans of soccer. And here was what they wrote on their blog. ESPN is setting up a damned if you do, a damned if you don't situation for women's sports fans, athletes, and supporters. From the outside, the concept is lovely. A women's sport presence on ESPN, exclamation point. The network is cleaning up its act and finally giving women's sports attention. But on the inside, it's merely shifting the blame. If you don't support espnW, you don't support women's sports. If you don't support women's sports when they are handed to you, like ESPN, and separate from the male mainstream, then why should ESPN cover it along with everything else? And this echoed a lot of what Dr. Kane was saying about the fears of some people about ESPNW. So I think the blogosphere and the academic critique were largely on parallel courses, and I think this was due in part to a lack of knowledge about what really ESPN really is. The next part of the presentation is we'll talk a little bit about the fiction versus fact. You want to jump in?
Yeah. So after the retreat, the Laura Gentilis folks did what smart people do, which was to ask members of the advisory board and others who had been there to give some feedback as to how they felt about the retreat and just the whole enterprise in general. And I frankly didn't want to do that in terms of sharing it publicly, because I did have some concerns. One of the reasons that I had concerns is that one of the comments that was made in one of the sessions was, well, how would ESPNW cover Tiger Woods? And how would ESPNW cover Phil Mickelson and all the struggles that his wife Amy has been going through around breast cancer? And that's when I translated that to, okay, so this is going to be Shape Magazine with box scores. You know, if you're a serious sports fan as a female or you care deeply about women's sports, why are you talking, or just sports in general? I don't want to know about Tiger Woods if I come to ESPNW, because if I want to know about Tiger Woods, I can go to a gazillion other places. So I wanted to have, particularly as a member of an advisory board, I wanted to have a private phone conversation with Laura and asked Nicole to join me because I felt like, you know, we had a similar independent critique. And she invited Katie Richmond to be in on the call, and it was truly wonderful. And I would just want to say again, and this is where, as I was listening to what Laura and Katie were saying, I thought to myself, man, there is a lot of fact versus fiction out there, and what you are telling us about what your intentions are around ESPNW is not registering, certainly in the academic community and clearly on the blogosphere. Because most people, for example, think that this is going to be a separate ESPNW light looking at women's sports. And they clarified a lot of stuff for us. And so during that phone conversation, I suggested to Laura that we think about changing this session today on the Tucker table to, rather than talk about deja vu all over again, talk about this in terms of fact versus fiction. And so we walked through with them what we were hearing was what people were sort of saying as major narratives about what ESPNW was all about. Again, in the academic community, mainstream media who were calling people like me for interviews about what it was all about, and the blogosphere. And it was very interesting to hear what their response was. And so we tried to kind of pin it down to 4 or 5 sort of major fact versus fictions about what their intentions are to be espnW and how it has been received very broadly across the country. So that I will now turn over to Nicole.
And I think in addition to that, Katie Richmond is the woman who's in charge of the ESPN social media platforms. And she had seen a post on her Facebook page that I think Austin had put up saying, oh, the next Tucker table is going to be on the construction lodge of ESPN : deja vu all over again. And that was also facilitated the conversation with them that was very open and transparent and was really enlightening. So I want to recognize that they are very much wanting to be in dialogue and conversation around this, and I think that's really a good point around this brand. So I'm just going to go through 3 or 4 facts and fiction, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the first one, as Dr. Kane mentioned, is that the fear that it will be ESPN light. And the truth is, from the materials and the information that we have received from ESPN, that espnW will be an authentic sports environment created with women in mind. And I have a few other things that I want to read to you right from their materials so I get it right. They want it to be about smart women talking about the stories that men are talking about, but from a different perspective. So that goes back to, how would we cover Phil Mickelson? How would ESPN cover the Super Bowl? They also want to say that this reaches out to women who are fans and women who are athletes. The source will be for additive, multidimensional coverage of sports that women already watch. So from their research, they found that women consume sports differently than men. And men tend to want the stats and the hardcore numbers, and women are busy and multidimensional, and they want to know just what's important. Now I'm generalizing there because I do think that there is a core of serious female sport fans, and I'm looking at Beth, who I know is a big professional football fan, who love the stats and love the quant and love all that about ESPN.com. But again, this brand is not speaking to that consumer. So their assurance is that ESPN will not be ESPN light, it will just do sport in a different way. Feel free to jump in.
I think that's fair.
Okay.
Well, excuse me, I think that one thing that Laura made very clear in that phone conversation is this is not about women's sports. Women's sports is a piece of this, but it is about treating women, serious fans, with respect as fans of men's and women's sports. I know we've said that, but I don't know that we can repeat it enough.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the confusion around this brand stems from that misunderstanding. The second one is that ESPN will only cover women's sport. That is also a fiction. The real truth is that they will serve the underserved female fan of both men's and women's sports. It's not only about women's sport. And when we pressed her and said, well, why is that? Because you could argue, well, women's sport is also underserved, so that's maybe a different market, but why the focus on both? And she said, we feel that by covering men's sport, it will add legitimacy to the espnW brand. And I said, well, what percent of coverage will be dedicated to women's sports versus men's sports? And she said, at the moment, they're conceptualizing it to be about a 60-40 split. Women's sports to men's sports. So there will be significant coverage for the female fan of men's sports in a different way. The third myth or fiction will be that ESPN is a TV channel. And this is not true. ESPNW is a digital brand, it's a .com, it's social, it's digital. There's no plans, to my knowledge, that espnW will be a sport channel. Now, if that were to happen, that would be fabulous. But it's not, the first phase of the launch does not include a TV channel. And much to my mother's chagrin, who thinks that because I was invited to the retreat that I was going to become a sports commentator on espnW. I wouldn't refuse the call, but I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen because there is no TV channel. So they'll be using a blog, social media, etc., and that is their plan for espnW. And if you want, the very little that you can find on espnW, they do have a Facebook page and they do have a Twitter feed. If you want to follow them, if you're into those social media platforms, you can. This is about all there is out there except for ESPN Rise, which is a digital magazine for female high school athletes, and this is in a beta testing phase right now. So if you type in ESPN Rise, you can go to the site, and they're actually asking for feedback around what do you think of this, how can we do this better, etc. So those three things are the only thing really that you're going to find about ESPN other than the blogosphere critique of ESPnW. And maybe my favorite fiction is that Dr. Kane, upon retirement, will be employed by ESPnW. That is not true, all right? I heard that from someone, I shared that with Dr. Kane, and we had a good chuckle over that. So I will not be a sports journalist, television broadcaster, and Dr. Kane will not be employed by ESPnW.
Never say never.
So at this point, then we just like to open it up for questions and comments.